Hello and welcome back to the World of Higher Education podcast. I'm your host this week, Tiffany MacLennan. Today, we're doing something a little bit different. With this podcast, as you know, we look at some of the major stories shaping the higher education sector around the world. This year, that reflection has also taken form not just as a podcast, but as a written report as well. A global year in review that examines how politics, demography, finance, and technology have reshaped the sector in 2025. If you're a loyal listener to the podcast, you know that if I'm your host, our guest is Alex Usher, President and CEO of Higher Education Strategy Associates, and also the author of this report. The full document can be found on the website, but the themes are already very clear. From the political upheavals in the United States to the growing effects of demographic decline to the quiet but dangerous rise of policy neglect in many countries, 2025 was a year in which global higher education felt unusually fragile, and in some places, on the edge of quite a reckoning. We're going to unpack some of those themes over the next 25 minutes and explore some of the stories that you may not have heard about. So I'm going to pass it over to Alex. Alex, you opened the report by saying 2025 was a year of monsters. Can you walk us through why that metaphor felt right for this moment in global higher education?
So I have a bad answer and a good answer. And the bad answer is that the year of monsters, that's a riff from Antonio Gramsci, who wrote in the mid 1920s. He said, the old world is dying and the new cannot yet be born. Now is the time of monsters. And I'm an old Antonio Gramsci fan. He was a communist and a social theorist, I guess. And I named my first ever blog after him. I used to blog about soccer. Not many people know that about me, but I did used to have a football blog, and it was called Gramsci's Kingdom. So I've always had an affinity for that term. But I think, the Gramsci quote is true in the sense that I think higher education is, like a lot of institutions in modern life, is largely a post-World War II response that made sense at the time. Like the way that we organize higher education, it made sense in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And I'm not sure it makes sense the way we're organizing it anymore. We're facing a very different world. And like a lot of institutions in Western society, we're having trouble getting rid of the old and bringing in the new. And so it does feel like a time of monsters. It does feel that we're caught, trapped between an old system and a new system. And it seemed like a pretty useful way to think about the situation that we're in. And so I talked about what are the main areas that are being, I guess, the forces that are impacting higher education. And I think I said, it was fascism, and it was neglect, and it was demographics, and it's technological change. And those four areas, I do think, kind of sum up the mega forces that we see impacting on the sector right now. Fascism is mostly the United States, but not all. Neglect is widespread in the West. Demographics affects both the East and the West, and technological change is pretty universal as well. You put those four together, those are the things that higher education is wrestling with.
On the train of fascisms, you call the United States the story of the year, maybe the decade for higher education. We have Rob Kelchin coming in next week to talk about his top 10 in American higher education stories. And I'm sure we probably could do 100 this year easily. But when you look across global reactions, what struck you most about how other countries interpreted what was happening in the United States?
I thought so there's a couple of things that are interesting. I mean, number one, I would say there's a lot of countries in Asia who assumed that Trump had a policy in mind. Like it wasn't they didn't interpret this, the many, many things that happened in the US as being, separate manifestations of a diseased mind, which I think is how a lot of people in both the United States and the rest of the West understood. They thought there was a policy behind it. They didn't understand it necessarily, but they didn't assume that it was, just the actions of an autocrat trying to bring a sector to heel. I think what I found disappointing in most of the world was that, in those first few months when it was clear that Trump and Musk and to an extent Kennedy were really trying to wreck American science, that there were huge data sets that were just not going to get collected anymore in areas like health, global measles monitoring or climate data. The emphasis was less on how do we save global science, right? Because the US, and, I think, you can give Trump his due here. I think there were lots of ways in which many countries were and do free ride off American science and the big investments they make. The emphasis was less how do we save global science and much more how do we exploit the situation for our own benefit, right? So, at least a dozen countries set up some kind of fund to attract American researchers. And it just betrayed a profound ignorance, I think, of how American science work and how powerful American science really is. The amount of money that the National Institutes of Health throw at health researchers in the US is absolutely, there's no other country in the world that can match that. Maybe China in mathematics, and there have been a lot of Chinese scientists going back from China to the US this year for sure. And I just think I think a successful country has been one like Austria, which threw, 50 million euros at the problem and they got 12 scientists out of it. You just can't expect the universities or the academics in the United States really to move on the basis of 1 year or two. I think things would need to get a lot worse before there were really a genuine exodus, like you saw out of the Soviet Union in the 90s or you saw out of Nazi Germany in the 30s. It's not happening.
Another one of the themes in the introduction is neglect, or the idea that many governments have kind of drifted
Mhm.
into the assumption that universities can kind of run themselves indefinitely. How widely do you see this pattern across the 25 systems that you were examining?
I don't think it's so much run themselves indefinitely as that they can be run with no new money. Right. I mean, the policy neglect is largely just, yeah, we'll just tell them to keep doing the same thing, but with 5% less. And where that's been, expressed most arrogantly, I think, is Mexico, where Claudia Sheinbaum, the president, just told institutions, well, you're just going to this work with Republican austerity, but she meant public spirited in this case. I think this is an issue that higher education shares with many institutions in Western society. Democracy being one of them. People just think democracy will take care of itself and we don't need to worry about its threats from people like, the Make America Great Again crew or AFD in Germany or, Reform in the UK. I mean, these are profoundly anti-democratic forces that we're seeing across the world, fascism in many cases. And we just assume that we don't need to upgrade how we protect democracies. And it's the same with universities. People just assume, oh yeah, they'll continue producing science, they'll continue educating people. We don't need to care about their upkeep. And really, that's I wouldn't say I saw it everywhere, but I think it's pretty prevalent in developed economies that higher education, we higher education's just been there and produced such great things for so long, we can't imagine them not doing it. And therefore, it's safe to ignore them. And I see that pattern repeating itself over and over across the OECD with very few exceptions.
If you had to identify one country right now that you think kind of illustrates maybe some of that financial pressures that universities are facing, which would it be?
Yeah, there's definitely not one because I think there's different kinds of financial pressures. I mean, I think the neglect episode, which is, we can cut 2% here, we can cut, 3 or 4% here. We are seeing that in a lot of countries, France, Canada, Australia, UK. I think that's pretty common in the developed world. You get a couple of, you have some countries where the government is actively working to destroy higher education, which would be the United States, and possibly the previous government in the Netherlands, although they got voted out in October. I think there's a number of countries where you have governments which are having trouble keeping up with very high inflation. And obviously, Argentina is one of those, Pakistan is one of those. And then I think you have countries where it's not that governments are not spending more, but demand is so far outstripping higher education that we are seeing crunches. And of course, Kenya is the obvious example there. It's a country where we've had institutions have a lot of difficulty paying their staff. We saw a 9-week strike in the fall. I mean, there are a number of countries like that. I think Nigeria is a little bit like that. But again, those are not a single type of financial crisis. There are multiple types.
Another theme that shows up quite prevalently in this report is demography, with nearly half of large systems seeing really stagnant or even declining enrollments.
Mhm.
How much of the decline actually is due to demography versus what is due to something else?
Well, again, I think again, there's a few different categories here. I think the most interesting stories are the places where the declines are not based in demography. So Turkey and Pakistan in particular have seen some pretty abrupt drops in student numbers in the last 5 years that are not driven by demography. I mean, those are countries where the probably reached the demographic peak 4 or 5 years ago, but the drop in student numbers far outstrips the drop in youth population. Iran is another one. Iran has had a much bigger demographic transition in the last few years. But still, even there, the drop is bigger than what you would expect given demography. That's a big deal because I don't think we've seen that in higher education history, right? Like participation rates always increase. That's been the story for 60, 70 years. And so we're starting to see some examples where that's not the case. There's what I would call normal demographic disasters, the ones we've been seeing for a long time. South Korea is one. The government had to pass a law to close what they call zombie universities in the private sector. Taiwan is declining fairly steadily. Russia's starting to stabilize after a very long demographic decline. The interesting number I think, is Poland, which has seen a very big demographic decline, but numbers are starting to come back up, and they're coming back up specifically because private higher education is doing such a good job. So that's a really interesting story, and I think it's one of the reasons people need to watch Poland. There's something different going on there. Other than that, what you're seeing are places like, Colombia, maybe Malaysia, certainly Canada, Australia, UK, places where the local demographics are flat. And so we're not seeing an increase in domestic enrollments. And what's interesting is this is starting to spread outside the Anglosphere. People are saying, "Hey, what about getting international students in to backfill those maybe slightly declining domestic numbers?" We'll see how that goes. But boy, I think there was at least a dozen countries out there who declared record highs in international students, and I would say it's not because demand is increasing. Maybe that's a little bit of it, but it's because they're increasing the supply of spaces to international students, and the prime mover is domestic demographics.
Alex, beyond the monsters, the report also highlights places that do actually continue to invest and expand their higher education systems. Which countries emerged as genuine bright spots this year?
So I think there's some long-term bright spots, right? I mean, I think India, the excitement that Indians have for higher education and the belief they have that they can copy China's science-driven route out of poverty, I think is pretty impressive. I think China itself, although it's not necessarily investing a lot of money right now, if you read their roadmap to 2035, that's a very ambitious document about, talking about what kind of system they want to build, what are the values they want to build into the system, and just a general, can I put this, commitment to data-driven improvement in higher education. I mean, the China report is, and they do a lot of experimentation. They're trying new fields of study. They're trying to build new types of institutions, and you just don't see anybody else doing that. We've got one page in the document that talks about what we call outstanding policy movers, places that did something really important. And the three that I like to highlight are Uzbekistan. Uzbekistan has done some really interesting stuff around international education, around expanding their higher education system. This is a system that has quintupled in size in the last 10 years or so. I mean, it really, and they're just trying everything, and they're good to go with that because, again, like India, they think they can pull off a Chinese style change in their society and their economy as a result of this. I think Greece is really interesting. Greece has finally made steps to move towards the European norm. They've gotten rid of 250,000 what they call permanent students, so people who stay registered as students to get student benefits but don't actually take courses. 250,000 people. Greece is not that big a country. 250,000 people got kicked off the rolls. They're bringing in private universities. They are changing security laws so that, in effect, universities are not havens for anarchists. I mean, these are big changes to the Greek system, and that's really important. And then there's Vietnam. Vietnam, it's not just that they're making big statements about let's have another 5 universities in the top 100. I mean, they've done that before, and lots of other countries have done that before. But now the kinds of policy things they're putting into place, they're paying attention to admission systems. They're paying attention to how to partner with institutions from other countries. They're talking about institutional mergers. Like, there's a lot of stuff going on. It's one of the most hyperactive policy environments in the world, and I think it's really exciting. So those three in particular, Greece, Vietnam, Uzbekistan, those are places that are really showing up in the higher education field these days, and I think it's really promising.
I think that leads well into this next question, but was there a particular region or even country where, the higher education story diverged pretty sharply from what you would have expected when you started this report?
I would say the most surprising thing I learned in the process of this was around private higher education. I know we just had Dan Levy on the show a couple weeks ago, and I think I referenced this, is the extent to which Western European systems are host to growing private higher education sectors. And I think back to our discussion with Nicolas Badret I guess it was a few months ago now, but Nicolas, he was telling us about how private sector systems are moving in France and in Europe. The American system, we always think of the American system as being, oh, that, so many big bad privates, but the American system is 70% public, 30% private. And France and Spain could pass that 30% number in the next couple of years, right? Those are really big systems. They're growing fast. Are they taking advantage of loose regulation? Maybe a bit. But I just think you've got in those countries what you have, and we're seeing it to a lesser extent in Italy and Germany as well. And as I said, in Poland, it's about 35% private. What we're seeing is there is a demand for a very different type of higher education that isn't classical 3 or 4 year undergraduate degrees. There's a lot more demand for professional master's degrees. There's a lot more, demand for mid-career learning. And the public sectors are not in these countries are not in the least equipped to do for it. They're not incentivized to do it. I think if you look at the way that their funding system works, they have no incentive to do it, but the privates do. That's really interesting, right? So this is, I would argue, it's a very different process than what Dan talks about, that mass private higher education that was demand absorbing, countries where they were rapidly increasing systems and it was just easier to let the private sector take some of them. That's not what's going on here. Like what we're seeing in European private higher education is something qualitatively different. And there's not many people looking at it. I think Christine Musselin in France is doing so right now, but there's not many people looking at it. And yet, arguably, it's one of the most interesting things in global higher education right now.
If you take a step back from kind of the global view of the report, take 1,000-foot step here, what do you see as the biggest lessons for Canadian higher education, the Canadian higher education sector, or Canadian higher education institutes to take away from what's in this report this year?
Well, I think the threat from private institutions is important. I don't think it'll happen here. I mean, I think our institutions are usually incentivized to go after some of these markets, but it's worth remembering there are countries with very dominant public sectors where the public sector is losing its dominance, and it can do that if it doesn't change fast enough. So I think that's one lesson. The second lesson is, look, there are countries that do believe that skills and education can make a difference in national competitiveness. And again, I would point to China, I would point to Vietnam, and I would ask Canadian policymakers why don't feel the same way about Canada? Because it's quite clear that they don't, right? Like I think if we look at the last few budgets, both provincially and federally, Canadians just like to dig stuff out of the ground, and they don't, the idea that we're going to have a service-driven export economy is just not on anybody's radar screen. And so why bother investing in higher education? I just think you have to look around the world and see what other countries are doing and ask themselves why we don't have as future-oriented a value system when it comes to education as others. And I think the last one is, it's the comeback of branch campuses. Like it's really interesting how many countries are experimenting with importing educational institutions from abroad. So India, for the first time, has decided to move into to allow branch campuses, and I think they've allowed, if I'm not mistaken, 15 or 16 in the last year, and the number of Canadian institutions was 0. Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan are now the third and fourth, I think, largest importers of educational institutions. Number of Canadian institutions is 0. I think the UK and Australia and increasingly some other countries have decided that if you can't grow abroad, you have to move to the people that need education. And where do we need education? It's where populations are still growing. That's not Canada. And so how do you create lasting institutions in these countries? We have to start thinking about that. I mean, I know Canadians have been, I know people to dislike it when I say this, but we've been very lazy for a very long time because we could just assume that people would come here and come to us and we wouldn't need to bother with all these relations in foreign countries and developing new institutions. Those days are over. And there are clearly other countries that can do this, and we need to catch up.
You end the introduction of this report by saying nothing is cracked yet, but parts of the system are close to a reckoning. What do you think are the fault lines that you'll be watching the most closely in 26?
Well, I mean, there's a few systems where literally the finances might break and you'd have institutions going bust, or you'd have large scale exoduses out of higher education. Argentina is one of them. Kenya is another. I think the UK will be very lucky if one or more institutions does not go bust. I think there's, I mean, that's the obvious stuff. Second, I think science as a whole is in trouble, right? I mean, I think we've seen a lot more, quite apart from the attacks on science in the United States, which will probably continue in a slightly different manner than we saw this year. But the role of scientific fraud, particularly in India, I think these are eventually these start damaging the cause of science generally. And so I think that research fraud and science fraud and rankings fraud are all things that could end up damaging the system quite a bit next year. I think those are the key areas that I would be watching for. I mean, demography is not going to kill anyone overnight. That's the point of demography. But I do think that I think the financing will cause some issues. I think the collapse of an AI bubble might take some pressure off universities because I think people are being. I firmly believe AI will change society and higher education enormously over 20 years. But a lot of the short-term pressures to which our other industries undergoing as a result of the sort of the schlock hype cycle, the Gartner hype cycle for AI, are profoundly damaging. So in some ways, an AI bust can't come soon enough for higher education to take the pressure off a little bit and let us think a little more clearly about how to use that technology and integrate that technology. So we'll see how that happens. I think technological change and change in the labor market and people's, as citizens, faith in higher education to continue to give higher education graduates a boost in the labor market. I think we're seeing cracks in that all over the world, and that is something that higher education really has to move hard on. We'll see what happens in the next 12 months. Again, that's not going to be a 12-month thing, but those are the kinds of areas where the fracturing is happening and will continue to happen, I think, for the next half decade or so at least.
Alex, thanks for the report.
Hey, fun as always to be on the other side of the interview.
And it just remains really for me to thank this time Alex Usher, Sam Pufek, and Alex Petit-Thorn for getting this report out into the public. You can check it out at higheredstrategy.com on our newly formatted website, which is gorgeous. So make sure to check it out regardless. Next week, as mentioned in the very start, Rob Kelchin from the University of Knoxville, Tennessee, will be joining us to talk about American top 10 higher education stories. And we have the list in advance, and you don't want to miss that episode. So we will see you next week. Bye for now.